What if the data that we've been using to get better at limited magic are wrong? I know. I'm the person who posted all of these videos using data to help us all get better at limited. So how can I say that the data are wrong? Well, I advocate for a nuanced use of these data. And one of the nuances that I think you always have to keep in mind is that, in my opinion, certain types of cards are systematically underestimated by the data. Cards where if all you did was evaluate them based on their 17 lands game in hand win rate, you would think they're much worse than they are in certain contexts. If you're wondering what all that jargon means and what data I'm talking about, I just posted a bird's eye view, semi-comprehensive introduction to data sources about draft and sealed. I'll link that video in the description. But in that video, I bracketed for further discussion that you can often make certain types of cards perform much better for you than their average across all the decks and games that they've appeared in would suggest. Today, I'm going to talk through those types of cards. I'm going to use examples from Secrets of Strixhaven, but I'll explain every example. So if you're listening audio only or you're not super familiar with the set, you really won't miss anything. So here are the types of cards that are systematically underestimated in the data, in my view. Number one is Buildaround cards. Cards that are not just good when you stick them in any old deck. They need to appear in the right context in order to perform well. Number two are highly skill testing cards. Cards where winning with them is more important than just drawing them, casting them, and oh, the game is over. You have to actually play them at the right moment, or in the right way, or in the right deck. And otherwise, they're a complete flop. And the third category is role players. By this I mean cards that fit into a certain slot that decks just need. And even though the card might be a clunker on average, it can do great work for you in the right context. Two quick points to make before I dive into giving you some examples of Buildarounds. First, I usually try to ground all of my claims in data. Well, today they're not grounded in data because I'm arguing with the data. I'm trying to tell you a way that I systematically disagree with the data in certain areas. So there's extra room for debate here. And I think most of the fun, not just of this kind of conversation, but also of using data about draft, is arguing about it and making up your own opinion. So super welcome anyone to debate any point here in the comments. That's most of the fun. And second, why do you want to know this? Well, in my view, intelligent and useful use of these data is not just taking for granted the win rates and stacking the highest win rate cards that you can into your deck. The data are an input for you to make nuanced card evaluations in the context of the game you're trying to play. So this kind of conversation, in my view, is a big level above just looking up the data online and taking those ratings for granted. This is one of the richest and most high leverage areas of nuance for you to wrap your mind around, no matter where you are on the journey of limited card evaluation. If you're trying to figure out how to use data as an input to card evaluation, I think these are systematic areas of underestimation that are important for you to know about. All right, so let's talk Buildarounds. These are cards that need a supportive shell of a deck that plays well with them in order to be good. In Secrets of Strixhaven, I didn't have to think long to come up with an example. In Secrets of Strixhaven, I built around this card, Return to the Ranks. X, a white, convoke. Return X target creature cards with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This card is sitting at a game in hand win rate. If you don't know what that means, go ahead and check out the video that I linked in the description where I tell you overall how you can learn about draft using 17lanes.com and what game in hand win rate means. So it's sitting at a game in hand win rate of 49.6%, which is a solid 6 or more percentage points below the average for 17 lanes users. This places it in F level territory, which you would think means just never play this card. And yet, my draft deck was a clean 7-1. So what was the idea here? I built around the card by only putting creatures of mana value 2 or less, pretty much, in my deck. And so the whole idea was Return to the Ranks every time I see it is going to be like a 4, 5, 6 for 1, because I can bring back basically any creature that I've had die through the whole course of the game up to that point. The funny thing about this is if you've ever played with Luris, the companion that says each permanent in your starting deck must have converted mana cost 2 or less, and then during each of your turns you may cast one spell with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard. In my deck, I basically traded Return to the Ranks as a copy of Luris. All of my creatures are mana value 2, and so I'm going to get to bring them all back from the graveyard. Same thing, right? I would say Return to the Ranks is actually a very functional example of a build around. I think you can take this card, say pack 1 pick 5, when you already have a bunch of 2-drops. And it's not that much of a wasted pick, because if you do end up in a highly aggressive white deck, that's a good place to be. And it's also just a good card to have if you're in that place. So a good exercise when you're trying to hone your usage of the data is to go through the cards at the very bottom and ask yourself, build around or not a build around? Return to the Ranks is very much a build around, but Pongify, destroy target creature, it can't be regenerated. Its controller makes a 3/3 green ape, a removal spell that gives them a 3/3 in compensation. If there's a way to build around that, I have not found it. So you could go through, is Choreograph Sparks a build around? Honestly, yeah, I've had this work really well in Prismari control. Is Comforting Counsel a build around? It's a build around, but it's not a good one. It turns out it's way too hard to activate. I know I have the scars of losing a lot of gems trying to make Comforting Counsel work. One that I really want to make work is Shamanic Revelation, 3 and 2 green for a sorcery, draw card for each creature you control, and you gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. Again, I don't think it's going to be good, but the cool thing about build-arounds is sometimes you don't know until you try it. This one's not going to be good, but I still want to do it. There are more examples of build-arounds among uncommons, so I just took these out from some of the D- or F level uncommons. 3 more examples. Arnin Deathbloom Botanist, the 2/2 for 2 and a black death touch, so when a creature you control with power or toughness 1 or less dies, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. If you just stick this card without any planning or preparation into a random green-black deck, it's not going to perform very well. But I know for a fact it can be really good if you arrange your deck to have a lot of cards that have power or toughness 1. A friend of mine nearly won a regional championship qualifier final round, game 3 of the match, with an Arnin and the Cauldron that lets you sacrifice a creature, and he was sacrificing the 1/1 pest that you can bring back from the graveyard. And so every time he sacrificed it, he drained his opponent for 3, and then he could bring it back and repeat that once a turn. Drain the opponent for 3 every turn. That's pretty powerful, but that's a build around. It's a D- if you just stick it in any old deck. Another one that I've tried without much success, but I believe it could be good, is Graduation Day. An enchantment for 1 white, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery that targets a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. The way to evaluate a card like this is to ask yourself, how many times would I have to trigger that repartee ability for me to be happy that I spent a card slot and a mana on this enchantment that does not directly affect the board? So how many would I have to play in the course of a game after casting Graduation Day to be happier with this than with some random, let's say 2/2 creature? And in order to hit that number, how many would I have to play in my deck? I think a reasonable number, if you went through that thought process, it would be way upwards of 10, I would say. Maybe not way upwards, but you probably need upwards of 10 sources, maybe 12 or more. And then, of course, there's the question of, is that even a good deck? A white-based deck that is running enough things to trigger repartee and also enough creatures to get the +1/+1 counter benefit of this card. Clearly, what its D- score on 17 lands is telling us is that on average, probably most of the time when people just stick it in a deck without going through that thought process, it plays out very badly. It's just not well enough supported. I also think Daydream might be in this category. A 1 white sorcery, exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it, and flashback 2 and a white. In your just generic average Silverquill deck, this turns out to not be anywhere near good enough. It has an F actually on 17 lands, but clearly there are situations where it could be good. Suppose I flicker my Emeritus of Ideation and I get to cast an extra Ancestral Recall. That would be pretty strong, and a +1/+1 counter to boot. I might not need Daydream in that situation, but I bet its average win rate would be pretty high if that's the only kind of case where people were playing it. So I would say this might be a build around as well. So if you practice the art of identifying build-arounds from among the worst cards, you can probably find some hidden gems that you can design decks around. And if you're anything like me, you might lose more gems in the long run because of the temptation to try to get these wacky build-arounds to work. But hey, sometimes like with my Return to the Ranks deck, you'll get a trophy where, hey, I have no idea if I would have gotten a trophy run if I just tried to build a generic Silverquill deck that time. All right, next up is cards that are extremely skill testing. In this category, I'm including cards that probably have more power than their win rate suggests. So remember, the main metric that we use to judge cards from 17 lands data is game in hand win rate, the proportion of games in which you drew that card that you go on to win. In between drawing a card and winning or losing a game is a series of decisions about how to use that card. If the card is a coalition victory, which just makes you win the game immediately, then you have no decisions to make, right? Just when to cast it for it not to get countered or something. But most cards have a lot more to them than that. So here are some examples from Secrets of Strixhaven that have even more than average in a way that I suspect holds their win rate down. So I have 2 examples that I'm very comfortable with, and then 2 examples that are more speculative, where I'm thinking this might be part of the story. And you do want to be careful with this category, which can be like, there's an arrogant way to take it, which is like, oh, you know, I'm so good that I can play these cards perfectly and most people are bad and play them badly. It's more like I have screwed up with a bunch of cards so often that I can clearly see how it hurts their average data. Like I participated in hurting their data because I probably could have won if I'd found the right line, and I didn't. So it's more of a warning sign to yourself to be like, I should be careful when I play this card because I think it has power, but I see a fingerprint in the data that it may be very hard to execute on. Okay, so the 2 that I'm very comfortable with. Number 1 is Wild Hypothesis. X and a green for a sorcery. Make an XX fractal, essentially. You make a 0/0 and put X +1 +1 counters on it, and then you surveil 2. Let's think about the number of decisions that this card requires. Not just makes possible, but requires in order to cast it. It's turn 1. I have nothing to do, but I play a forest. I could make a 0/0 that immediately dies and surveil 2. Is that worth it for me? It's turn 2. I have nothing to do, but I have a forest and another untapped land. I could make a 1/1 and I could surveil 2. Is that worth it for me, or do I want to wait until next turn? But maybe I have a 3-drop next turn, so would I rather have the 1/1 surveil 2 for 2 and a 3-drop and potentially nothing on turn 4? Or would I rather have a 3/3 on turn 4, surveil 2, along with my 3-drop and set up my next draws, right? You're constantly weighing the value of playing this card right now against the value of playing it later on. And also, it comes with 2 surveils attached, which is 2 different decisions that you have to make. So every time you make this card, you're making such a complicated bundle of decisions, but I've seen how it can be great. It was in a deck that I won a box with in the Arena Direct Sealed. It was in a deck that I won a sealed portion of a regional championship qualifier with, or top 8'd. I've seen how this card can be really good. I also played with it at pre-release and it felt strong, but I've also had plenty of times where it was too little too late. It makes an understated creature. The surveil doesn't actually change that much for you, and you just wish that you had like a creature with good stats and a good ability. So it's really hard to tease out the effect of how hard it is to play against the raw strength of the card, but I think it's weighed down. It's sitting at like a D or D plus on 17 lands right now. I think it's weighed down just by how hard it is to play. Another card like that is also in green-blue. It is fractalized. So Quandrix has a lot of these mathy hard decisions, right? It's kind of the flavor of it. So X and a blue, until end of turn, target creature becomes a green and blue fractal with base power and toughness each equal to X +1. It's even hard to like think through what this card does, right? But basically you make a fractal, or you make a creature have the power and toughness equal to the amount of mana that you just spent on fractalize. So there's a question about, do I use it to push more damage by growing my own creature? Do I use it to blank a removal spell? Someone last gasps my creature and I shoot out a fractalize for X equals 0, for X equals 2, sorry, to give it just a little boost. No, try again. For X equals 3. See, I'm even making mistakes and I'm not even playing the card. Or do I wait until my creature gets into combat with your creature, and then I don't have enough mana available to make my creature bigger than your creature, but maybe I can make your creature equal to a 1/1 by using X equals 1 fractalize on your creature in combat, and then your creature dies. So it's a kill spell, a counter spell or protection, or a pump spell depending on the situation and how much mana you have. It doesn't have great stats. It actually has very bad stats, and I really do wonder if it's because it's just so hard to play. I put in 2 more in here that I'm not so certain about. I put in Library of Alexandria, even though its stats are good, because it is really, really hard to play. First, you have to think in a complicated way about mana bases. So Library of Alexandria is a B right now, B as in Bravo, on 17 lands. So that's a good win rate. It's correlated with people winning more after they draw it. But Library of Alexandria is a, many thousand or at least $1,000 piece of cardboard. One of the most powerful cards ever printed in Magic. That's worth a B in Contemporary Limited. I mean, maybe, but also number one, as I was saying, it disrupts your mana base. So you have to think about, does this replace a land, or will that make it too hard for me to produce colored pips? Sorry, if you don't know what Library of Alexandria does, tap to add a colorless, tap, draw a card, but activate only if you have exactly 7 cards in hand. So then, of course, that second part is very difficult as well. Both parts of this card are hard to think about. This is kind of why they don't print cards like this anymore. You often, if you haven't played with this card, you will often get into situations where you're having to make really spur of the moment decisions in the first few turns of the game about whether you, for example, play a creature or want to draw up to 8 cards in hand and then play something. You may have to hold back on removal spells in order to still be able to draw off of the library. There are just all sorts of ways that you have to make judgments about, should I play the card, or is the value of drawing a card from my library better than casting this card right now? You end up dancing on this knife's edge where you're trying to figure out just how far you can push your damage taking abilities and, falling behind on the board in order to get card advantage. So I think it would be an A+ if it were an easier one of the most powerful cards ever printed. All right, and then the last one that I'm also not so sure about is Witherbloom Charm. I just put this one in here because it is pretty complicated. A black and a green for an instant. You may sacrifice a permanent if you do draw 2 cards. You gain 5 life and destroy a non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less. Now, there are multiple of these charms that are multimodal. I actually think Witherbloom Charm is the hardest. Gaining 5 life often comes with a synergy advantage, and then sacking a permanent to draw 2 is often a trade-off when you're looking to get a little bit of advantage over your opponent. It's often a trade-off against, do I want to do that, or do I just want to destroy a small thing that they have? So I think this may actually be the hardest one to play. I think it may be dragged down partly by that, but it's hard to tell how much it's the difficulty of playing it versus Witherbloom just not playing out that great in the data. But basically, once you notice that a card may be dragged down because it is skill testing, if you feel confident that you've cracked the puzzle for how to play with that card, then you can gain an edge by snapping up the card that everyone thinks is not very good and playing with it accurately. So for me, I feel that knowing when to put Wild Hypothesis in my sealed decks has been an edge for me. It gives me a beater that other people might leave on the sidelines because I feel pretty confident after playing a bunch with the card that I know roughly where on the curve I want to play it. My first time playing with the card at pre-release, I was scratching my head the whole time. By the way, before we move on to the last category, there actually was an entire deck like this in Lorwyn Eclipsed. I believe the entire Goblins deck was pulled down by how hard it was to play. The whole Blight thing where you put -1/-1 counters on your own creatures was just so inherently complicated to figure out how to do well. How much do I want to spend resources to make my own creatures worse in order to get certain types of synergy advantages? Watching good players play with the Goblins decks, like Paul Cheon, I think rattled off a bunch of Winnabox runs with Goblins. It was a demo in how hard it could be and how effective it could be if you figured out how to do it. So sometimes an entire color pair can be dragged down by how skill testing it is. Right now, I think Prismari to some extent is like this in Secrets of Strixhaven, but the best example I've seen in the last several years of draft, I think, is Goblins in Lorwyn Eclipse. It was way down in the data, but it had tons of power if you could crack the code. All right, now let's talk about role players. There are a lot of different roles that cards can play in a deck, right? Sometimes you want some card advantage. Sometimes you want some removal. But what I'm going to focus on right now, because I think this is a thing that's happening in the Strixhaven data, so it's topical, is something that every single deck needs: a win condition, or quite simply, cards that can just kill the opponent. I've talked a little bit about this before, but back when I used to draft in the Dark Ages, ripping open M10 core set boosters, one of the best cards that you could crack was Air Elemental. At least that's what we all thought. There wasn't data back in those days. I wasn't a great player then by any stretch. But a 4/4 for 5 flying was just so good. Yes, like your opponent could cast Murder on it, but there was not that much that could kill one of these things. And in terms of like stats plus evasion, it was just the tippy top. A 4/4 for 5 flying was an automatic 5-turn clock to an opponent at full health By the time you play it on turn 5, it's often like a 2-turn clock, and there were just not that many resources going around to either deal with or race this kind of card. So back in the old days, basically any flyer with 3 or more power was kind of considered a bomb. Those days are behind us because in rate, anytime I'm spending 5 mana on a creature these days, I basically need it to be very, very, very difficult for my opponent to kill before the next turn when I'm going to get to attack with it. Or I need it to have a strong enters the battlefield effect, like Wix Patrol from Bloomburrow is a 3-power 5-drop that kills a creature when it enters. That's the kind of thing that I'm looking for. But I think Jason Yee made this point on Limited Level Ups podcast, a few years ago, that even though these cards are not good on average, life totals have not changed. An Air Elemental on turn 6 is still often like a 2 or 3 turn clock for your opponent in Limited. They still do need to answer it. It's just that there are a lot more resources going around to answer it with. But people underestimate this type of card at their peril. Fundamentally, compared to the life total that Magic card players still have, 4 power in the air is something that needs to be dealt with. So way down at the bottom of the Secrets of Strixhaven rankings, you can find a few of these people that play or cards that play this particular role of just being not exactly a win condition in the sense that if I play it, I'm going to win, but it's definitely a way to win. If I clear the board and my opponent doesn't have an answer, this thing will kill them sooner or later. My number one favorite role player of the set has been Hungry Graphalon. That's actually my favorite card in Secrets of Strixhaven, other than the Mystical Archive stuff that I have nostalgia for. This is my favorite new card. This is the 3/4 for 3 and a green, reach and increment. It's understated, it's awkward, it's clunky, but it eventually pretty quickly just becomes a 5-power reach creature that stops your opponent's little flying attacks and is just going to kill them pretty quickly. And it's something that they just feel like actively guilty for having to spend a removal spell on. They're like, I can't believe I'm trying to kill your Hungry Graphalon with my premium removal. I had this in many sealed decks that worked very well, where I was super happy to see the giraffe. And it's because fundamentally just putting some stats on the board can get the job done. I'm not saying on average this is a great card, but every deck needs some win condition. In fact, every deck should have many win conditions. And if you're short on win conditions, stick that D- Hungry Graphalon in your deck, and I can tell you from experience, it'll sometimes just win. Another card that I'm way higher on than the data would suggest is Rearing Embermare, the 4/5 reach haste for 4 and a red. I will very gladly put this in like a Prismari tempo deck where I'm just looking for one top end threat. It's a D- or an F or something on 17 lands, because I think a lot of people just stick these creatures in decks when they're maybe newer to Magic and just looks like a powerful creature and they don't yet know about the rate that creatures should have to merit a card slot. But at the end of the day, it's still a creature that can still do a big chunk of damage. And it kind of does it out of nowhere. Haste on a 4 or 5 is a pretty big game. Another card that can just kill your opponent out of nowhere is Sneering Shade Rider, a 3/3 for 4 and a black flying. When it enters, drain your opponent 2. It's not really where it's at in this set for a few different reasons, but fundamentally this card can be very powerful in different contexts. I believe Glide Dive Duo, which this is a functional reprint of, it just has the creature types changed. That one was like the number 2 highest performing black common in Bloomburrow. And now it's the worst or almost the worst black common in Secrets of Strixhaven. Fundamentally, 3 power in the air, especially one that drains 2 on entry, is a card that can win games. So whenever I see these things way down on the average card quality list, I really want to separate them from cards that kind of do nothing. For example, in terms of win rate, Rearing Embermare is an F right alongside Oracle's Restoration, which is one green for a sorcery. Target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. You draw a card and you gain 1 life. Rearing Embermare is a card that can kill your opponent out of nowhere. Oracle's Restoration is a card that does nothing and then replaces itself pretty much. So when you're trying to find hidden gems and valuable pieces at the very dregs of the game in hand win rate list, another good question is to ask yourself, could this card realistically play a valuable role in my deck? I've talked about win conditions, but also like a really, really clunky removal spell could for sure be a valuable role player in a deck that has 0 removal. All right, so those are the 3 types of cards that the data are all wrong about: Buildarounds, highly skill testing cards, and role players. I'm super curious for whatever I missed, whatever cards I misclassified, whatever cards I should have put in those buckets, and the other buckets that I should have had. And I'm sure that you have no shortage of ideas of your own. So I really look forward to seeing what everyone thinks about this classification. And I hope that you have a lot of fun and also maybe pick up some extra wins by looking through the very bottom of the win rate data and finding some of these hidden gems that actually can go in a deck, so long as it's the right deck, and win a lot more than their average win rate suggests. Until tomorrow, have tons of fun playing Magic, and don't be afraid to play hungry Graphalon.